Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for staying after Randy's excellent speech. We've got a terrific panel here this morning. We're going to be focusing on who pays for the internet, a global perspective, and we've got a terrific panel. But let me at the beginning emphasize one of the difficulties both of this subject and of putting together this terrific panel is that there is such a great variety of views about this particular subject that we cannot, in a reasonable sized panel, express all of those variety of views. So we'll be going very quickly, I will be going very quickly to you all for questions and comments because I think taken as a whole we have much of the views on this extraordinarily important question. I've been struck over the past day or day and a half of the comments about the creative destruction that is the theme of this conference, that the internet itself is at the heart of all of the conversations. And the internet, of course, is a relatively recent phenomenon, as you all know, and is changing and growing as we speak. And so underscoring the changes that we are all talking about in the regulatory and the marketplace impact of these changes is the fundamental question of how the internet itself will change and who and what will be paying for those changes. This is a critical issue and one that is not just, of course, a focus of policy issues here in the United States, but is truly global. As Randy mentioned, we had recently, just this past year, at the Wicket, this was one of the fundamental issues. It is a continuing source of debate, and just as one illustration of that debate, today is the beginning of a major preparatory meeting for the Americas taking place in Uruguay under the auspices of the International Telecommunications Union as they prepare for the World Telecommunications Development Conference next April, which is supposed to be in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. We will see, inshallah, as they say in that part of the world, of whether or not that will take place, as well as a review of the World Summit on the Information Society, which was the UN Heads of State Summit in 2003 and 2005. And the number one thing that the ITU, in its opening comments at the conference today, that they said was on the agenda for discussion amongst the Americas, was broadband rollout with an emphasis on reduction of internet access costs. And so for those of you who think that the battle has been already fought about the declining costs and so forth, my view is that that battle, in terms of its fundamental construct and its fundamental relationships, is still very much alive in the international view. It is not just, of course, a U.S. issue, but in fact an international issue. And we've got a terrific panel today to discuss those various issues. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panels to give just about 2 or 3, maybe 4 minutes of opening comments, and I promise to be somewhat strict on this so that we can go immediately into the Q&A and the discussion about this. Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind starting off with a few comments.
Sure. Thanks, David. My comments are going to be in the form of stories or parables. The first story I'll tell is back in the 1990s, after the 96 Act was created and a lot of new countries were setting up competitive systems, phone systems. I was running an office at the FCC that was in charge of international work, and we were pressing strongly the wisdom and the merits of unbundling as we went out and were giving advice and technical assistance to other countries, oftentimes hand in hand with USTR. Years later, when I was working with Blair Levin on Wall Street, I happened to be at a conference, and one of the ministers of one of these countries came up to me and said, "We did everything you told us to do, and we still did not get investment." That's the first story. The second story is about at the same time in the U.S., and it was part of the 96 Act reform, was reforming what was called the accounting rate system, which was the payment that telephone companies would pay each other to settle traffic internationally. And at that point, this accounting rate system was the highest form of hard currency, the major form of hard currency for a lot of developing countries. The rates were sometimes upwards of a dollar a minute. And so what we were doing then was telling these countries, if you just reform the accounting rate, you bring down the prices, you don't transfer those high prices over to the internet, you will see regional economic development. Your countries will get jobs brought to them because it's easier to get traffic in and out of there. They did that, they had to, they were forced to. I still have the scars from implementing that. But they got the economic development by reforming the accounting rate system. That's the second story. The third is at the same time, and David's points sort of previewed this, there were a number of countries that were hurting from getting rid of this accounting rate payment, a lot of them Asian. Australia was another one who were pushing for the ITU and other international bodies to regulate the traffic exchange, the internet traffic exchange. They were very unhappy and upset because the internet traffic was all routing through the US, even between two Asian countries. We told them at the time, just have some patience. If you have good policies and good regulations, you'll start seeing economic investment development regionally that will reduce the costs. They did, and it did. So those are my three stories or parables. There are two trends that make the issue of who's going to pay for the internet, I think, increasingly important. The first is, as we all know, just the sheer centrality of the internet to our public lives, our private lives, our physical lives just keeps on increasing, and we don't want to have a segment of the population left behind. In the US, Comcast, my company, is trying to address that with Internet Essentials, but as David's keenly aware, when we were dealing in the lead up to the wicket, just the visceral reaction of the countries who were there who want internet but don't know how to attract investment was a very key point. Second, and my final point, is the sheer size of the amount of traffic just is growing so much that we need to take seriously the ability to invest to carry that traffic. It's hard to make zettabytes and exabytes meaningful, but we all know what those curves look like that Cisco puts out, and we need to figure out a way to be able to continue to develop the network so that we can handle that traffic. So in preparation for this over a few weeks, I was asking people I would run into who are experts in international work, their answer to this question, trying to get more input, and was surprised, I have to say, at the consensus that I heard from people both on the right and the left politically who have been doing international work for a long time, which is you need to have private investment. That has to be the core. You need to figure out ways for all these countries to have return on investments to the companies that come in and invest, and then you have to target very narrowly where you need public or international support to provide to fill in the gap.
Thank you very much. Ed?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'll start with a slight diversion from the specific topic and mention disruptive competition. We have a website just called Disco, which is actually so relevant to the event, I couldn't help mentioning it. But getting to the specifics of who the internet and who pays, I just create a basic foundation of understanding, which everybody here really knows. It's the internet is a network of networks. It's a mutual benefits ecosystem. Every network operator, including private platform network operators, pay for their own network, including routers, switchers, servers, fiber optic and coax cable, copper wired networks and wireless towers, and transmission equipment. If applicable, shared cost interconnection peering across public exchange points is common. Satellite uplinks and downlinks are part of the internet. Undersea cable are a foundation of the global internet. Distance and volume are both relevant to costs. The large internet application and content platforms provide or purchase most of their own long-haul transport or transit and local caching of content in order to reserve more long-haul capacity for non-cacheable communications. Content providers therefore have to be understood that they have their own costs in networks and data centers. That's sometimes ignored in discussion on the topic. I would also, I think, just say, because I think we're going to get into this, it's important to understand the benefit of the internet in non-just economic terms. It's obviously tremendous economic importance, and for many, many reasons, the users of it and the creators of it. But some of the principles that I think public policy tries to focus on when we deal with net neutrality and other issues are, and I think Randy made a great point in saying user power, I would say user choice, same thing. the ability to innovate without permission is a core part of the internet, its creation, and its utility going forward. Application blindness in terms of pricing and low cost for application innovation. Because the internet at the end of the day is an ecosystem where many players and participants add to value. They don't just do it with dollars and cents. They do it with brain power, innovation, creativity, and all of that needs to be weighed when coming up with what kind of structure, what kind of rules we have. And last word on just the concept of regulation. You know, we're not for regulation or against regulation. We want smart regulation. And we want efficient regulation, we want up-to-date, modern regulation that recognizes current realities. And I think people who want to get into the don't regulate or too much regulation, I hope we would talk about what is smart regulation.
Very good. And speaking about smart, we're very pleased to have Carlos. And Carlos López Blanco, everyone knows he's with Telefonica. Let me remind you that Telefonica is not only the largest Spanish telephone company, but also is one of the world's largest, in large part because of its very extensive operations throughout the Americas. So he has experience both from a developed and a developing world perspective. Carlos?
Thank you, David, and thank you to TPI for this invitation that gives me the opportunity of sharing the views of a European and Latin American operator. I will be, as David has asked, very brief, and I will propose only some ideas that can fit the debate in the panel and with the audience. Who pays for the internet is the motto of this panel, and this may appear as a very provocative question, but really it's not, because the answer to this question is very obvious. The consumer is the one who pays for the internet. The relevant question, in my view, is what internet users pay for and to whom. If we take a look to the figures, and apart from video contents, which are of course very relevant, our customers, or the customers, pay directly for two notions: access to the internet and applications, and indirectly for advertisement that they receive over the line. They pay for access roughly 1 trillion in 2012, 9 billion for applications, and 60 billion for advertisement is the revenue of the advertisement business online. So that means that telecom operators receive 9 of every $10 spent by our customers on the internet, and we think that this gives us a central position in the internet world that is not always well recognized by regulators and by the rest of the agents in the internet world. Which are the issues that we, from this perspective, consider are more relevant in the internet debate? The first one, and is one very traditional, is the investment in broadband and how to have the right regulation to feed this process of investment, which is needed if we want to cope with the traffic growth. Second, we think that there is a second point which is important, is to have that we have called a sustainable business model for the internet. That means to have a level playing field, to have a possibility of practicing flexible business models based for telecom operators in quality of service. And one point that we consider is critical, and I think that Randy has explained very well, the pricing policy, the flexibility for pricing policy for operators, and finally, a new interconnection policy, a new interconnection model, we consider that is important. Third point, net neutrality. Let me say that net neutrality is not, at least for Telefonica, a problem. We are open to discuss everything around net neutrality, and this is why we are asking now the European authorities to approve a new regulation on net neutrality. We think that transparency and non-discrimination are sufficient to cope with all the problems that the debate on net neutrality is raising. But that we think is that in 2013, the concept of net neutrality is becoming partial and obsolete. Partial because net neutrality is out of the concerns of our consumers. And when we ask our customers on the problems that they consider they have using the internet, net neutrality is not one of them. And we think that we have to move to a different debate that we want to open, which is the debate around the open internet. What we consider that is or should be an open internet where all players can develop new model and where users have options and choices without being tied to specific agents or suppliers. An open internet is an internet without monopolies that could limited options and choices for users. So finally, we are proposing a new agenda for the internet public debate in the telecom sector and in the ITC sector, based on real problems of our customers and non-artificial problems, and based on the responsibility that the telecom operators we have of providing our customers with the best internet experience. And we consider that we have to add to the net neutrality and the other points of the agenda some other problems that are at the center of the concerns of our customers and the experience of our customers in internet. For instance, the portability of the digital life that we consider that should be guaranteed to our customers. The interoperability of operating systems, especially in the mobile arena. The problems of privacy, the problems of security, or the need of transparency in some areas as the advertising online. So we think that we have to broaden the scope of the discussion on the internet, not just the traditional discussion around regulation of broadband or the new discussion on the net neutrality. We think that we have to put on the agenda all the problems that our customers are experiencing in the use of the internet, because they are the one who pay for the internet, and they deserve the best experience when they are using the internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, you're batting cleanup.
Well, I don't have a stake in this game, but from my talk yesterday, I focused very heavily on regulation, particularly on wholesale regulation to fixed networks, which has sort of dominated the debate in telecom for close to a decade in the United States and elsewhere, and continues to be a considerable issue in Europe. The concern about wholesale regulation is that it simply diminishes the incentive to invest. And as we heard Randy talking this morning, the riskiness of deploying assets simply increases over time because of the technological progress and the uncertainty of how markets are going to evolve. How will wireless evolve? Will it substitute increasingly for fixed wire services, making the investments in fiber, the sunk costs of fiber which cannot be moved, leading to a stranded cost problem? If so, then how do you price access to that for someone else, or do we get rid of wholesale regulation altogether? Now, we have decided that in this country rather dispositively, but other countries, particularly on the continent of Europe, are still arguing this proposition. And as I mentioned yesterday, in Australia and New Zealand, after extremely contentious debates, they simply evolved into a government-provided network. The risk of doing that, of course, is that we go back to status quo ante, pre-1998 in Europe and so forth, where the government has a stake in the specific outcome of a specific network, and therefore does not have the incentive to allow free entry. The idea that we're going to have smart regulation, we have to understand, is all regulation is political, and we have to consider what the political stakes are. Once we launch a regulatory policy which is designed to increase competition in someone else's network, and it evolves into the government provision of the network, I think we are back to a very dangerous situation. Also, I think we should take note of the discussion yesterday by Laura Martin of how she thinks those who own the last mile should be evolving to all IP provision of services, and more going to over-the-top video sorts of distribution of video services. That creates enormous uncertainty in terms of exactly how that market will evolve, how much of it will be supported by direct consumer payments, and how much by advertising. We don't have any experience on that yet, very little experience, because the number of people who are relying on over-the-top video and relying on it principally for their video services is still a very small minority of the population. So we're in a very uncertain world a world in which the riskiness of deploying assets is actually increasing, and in which we have to be very careful not to constrain or overly discourage private investment, whether it's here or elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. Rebecca, one of the things that Robert mentioned is Australia and that very different model that we see down under with the national broadband network that's being created. And by the way, Robert, the numbers I've heard are somewhere between $40 and $50 billion. There was some question you raised yesterday. But I note that it's both a very changeable set of numbers, but also one that's very political. Australia is about to have an election just in about 2 weeks or so. And one of the primary questions there politically for the whole country is what sort of network they should be building and how they should be building it. Rebecca?
So I was, last week was at another conference in Aspen and spent a lot of time with their former communications minister. I'm just going to stay in Aspen. I hope somebody puts another conference up soon.
That's Stephen Conroy.
Stephen Conroy, and he's just because of the political changes in Australia has ceded that position, but he's been a real champion, I think a real believer in their national broadband plan. But a few interesting sort of perspectives came out of my conversations with him. One is he described the plan, what they're doing, and it goes to Bob's point about the at-risk. They are, in a sense, they've shut down, part of the deal is they have shut down the private networks. The only way to control the risk of building out this government-owned network is to shut down the private network. So they are very unabashedly creating a single government monopoly, and that will be the only network that will be available to people in that country. They're going to be building it out over a period of 10 years. As Bob mentioned yesterday, it'll cover not the whole country, but a good part of it. I think 93%, if I remember right, is the percentage of the country, the population that will be served, and the rest of it in remote areas will be served with satellite. He was, as I said, he's very keen on this system, but it is costing them an enormous amount of money. The estimates that I saw after we talked were that what it's costing per household for the government to build this out in Australia is about double what it cost, I think, Verizon, and more than that, what it's costing Google to build out in Kansas City and Provo, although Provo, the dollar purchase kind of helps there. But they hope to privatize it in 5 years, and they have no idea who's going to keep on paying for the maintenance of it. They have no idea really what the privatization is going to look like. So even in the best case scenario, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty on the back end. And they are a country that had surpluses, budget surpluses for a number of years. They've been fiscally very fortunate. They now have a deficit, but it's much lower than ours, much lower than European countries. And so they had more flexibility in deciding to sink all this money into this national broadband plan. If you imputed the cost of the cost of what they're doing in Australia to the U.S., it would be over $200 billion that the U.S. would have to do a comparable system. So he was very clear, even though, again, he's a champion of this, he did not claim that this was a model that would work for other countries. He viewed it as something they had to do because their unbundling approach had been so unsuccessful in Australia. Telstra had such a horrible network that they decided that they need to just shut down and basically do, whatever the movie is where you're going back a couple of decades. I don't know, what's the movie? Is that Back to the Future? Okay, I don't watch enough TV. But they're doing that in Australia, and I think it's a fascinating experience. I hope I'm still around to see what happens 10 years from now and see what the Australia experiment turned out, particularly as compared to, I think we've got 3 models going on, 4 maybe with the developing countries. We've got Australia, we've got what is happening in Europe now, where they're realizing that very severe unbundling system didn't allow them the investment for deployment to the next generation, and then we have the U.S. system, and so it'll be good to watch how they all are playing out over time.
Yeah, let me ask both Ed and Carlos, do you have a view? Is what's going on in Australia, which is also similar, not identical, similar to what Singapore did, Qatar is doing some of this, a few other countries are. Is this Back to the Future? Is this something that in fact is a model that others ought to be replicating, or is these just reactions to specific problems in specific places? Ed?
Well, I suppose I'm definitely not an expert on Australia. I do, and we are strongly committed to the value of a competitive marketplace. creating, value for society and customers at the end of the day. It is hard to imagine that over time, a single government entity is going to be able to have the upkeep, the technological advances, continue to improve a network that would really be beneficial for society. However, it's not impossible. Singapore's the size and scale of Singapore is one thing. Australia is very different. It'll probably be a fascinating experiment to watch. One of the factors that we've always cited when we have been somewhat down on governmental getting into the internet space was, frankly, the issue of governmental control and access to private information of its users. I suppose that argument's changed a little bit in light of the last month or so of surveillance issues. But it is, in fact, one of the issues that I think should be concerned to Australian citizens, that you will now have a government agency with clearly automatic access to everything you do on the internet. And I don't know how they're going to deal with that, to what extent, Rebecca, whether your discussion with her talked about that, but what protections are there for citizens' privacy in that kind of a network?
Carlos?
David, so I think that the Australian case implies two different issues, not just the problem of the ownership of the network. There is whether or not to have a single network for all the provider of services in a country, and second, whether or not this network should be private or public. So we think that the answer in our perspectives of these two questions is very clear. First, we think that in a world of technological neutrality, to defend the single network system is a nonsense. We think that there is the experience shows that platform competition, if based on technological neutrality, is the best and most innovative way of promoting the broadband investment. So first, we think that the model of a single network for all providers is not the best one. And we consider that based on this technological neutrality, that we have to be realistic in what in this scenario network means. A network means not just a physical reality, but a capability of management. So we think that to have a situation of platform competition and network competition is compatible with network sharing, is compatible with co-investment in networks, etc. So we think that we should be flexible enough, but at the same time, we consider that one single network for all is not a good model. And there is a second discussion that we know very well, because we have this discussion not in Europe but in Latin America. Is the role of public money, public investment in the telecom sector in the deployment of networks. Now we are in a discussion in Mexico in the context of the reforms promoted by the Mexican government, in which the government is trying to have a single mobile network that with access to the rest of operators. So we think that the experience shows, and Latin America is a good example of that, that private investment is the more flexible way of promoting the deployment of broadband and the deployment of new services. And we firmly believe that private investment should be the center of the process of investment in this telecom sector. And I insist that Latin America is a very good example. Telecommunications in Latin America are a very big success and has been driven by private investment and not by the public sector of the government.
Ed?
Just another couple comments. We've experienced, I think, in many areas of government, what we call mission creep. And I guess I would have to ask, what exactly will be provided? What temptation to get into applications and services? What is the Australian government going to be providing? And then, of course, you get into net neutrality. If you have private players at that space, are they going to have, and how's the government going to adjudicate fairly net neutrality issues with outside players who want to provide applications? I think that's a big issue. And the other one is the obvious one that we should have mentioned at the beginning, which is political censorship. The ability of government to frankly have a huge impact on the public discourse that would take place over the internet. And certainly those are all problems that we historically have said we have a real problem getting government that deeply into the provision.
Yeah, I would note in the case of Australia, they've claimed that the national broadband network would be purely wholesale, that they would be limited in that way, which of course is part of the reason why I think Rebecca was so inquisitive about the question of the long-term economics of the network. And of course, Australia, and particularly Minister Conroy, is quite famous, perhaps in some situations even infamous, about the filtering issue that has been raised in Australia by the government and the controversy that's been swirled around that. Robert, you look like you want to jump in here.
I wish I came on this panel at the 11th hour, so I couldn't bring my research up to date as what's going on in Australia, but Rebecca at least had some discussions with people from Australia. What has happened to the Telstra cable network? Telstra had two separate networks, a telecom network and a cable network. What we do know is that getting to rather substantial speeds for broadband, 50 megs and more, through DOCSIS 3 is a very cheap way to go to roll out high-speed broadband, particularly in an urbanized country like Australia. Is that to be retired also and not to compete with the national network?
That is my understanding, but I could be wrong.
That's a great social decision.
So, can I also
That's
just,
sinking the cost completely, yeah.
The other thing, and it comes up in art, there's a lot of discussion about public funding. You know, there's a lot of focus now on municipal broadband subsidies. We're talking about Australia, which is like the Uber public funding. Europe, now a lot of the countries, France, for example, because they had kept the retail and the wholesale rates down so low, doesn't have investment coming in to build out fiber and next generation. So they're looking at, I met with their regulators last year, and they're looking at putting massive subsidies in, public monies to come in. I think these are all important individual country, locality choices. You've got to weigh what's the most important thing to do with what's a limited amount of funds that you have available, apart from the distortion that could come in competition. And one of the things, you know, I was struck with a couple of things. One is in the U.S. there's a lot of criticism of how badly this country's policies have led, and that we're lagging behind. And lagging behind globally. And Bob talked about this yesterday. But in fact, the investment in this country has been in broadband over the last 15 years has been over $1 trillion, which is more than the entire GDP of South Korea, and we aren't number one in speeds. That is absolutely true, but and there's a lot of criticism because we're only number 8th, which when you think about our country's population, we have 7% of the population density that Korea and Singapore do, which is what the comparison is to. And so we're not number one, but we're really solid when you look across all the metrics of broadband performance. And in contrast to some of the other social economic challenges that we have in this country, we're 48th in infant mortality internationally, and we're 24th out of 27th in the percentage of people who graduate from high school. And so I think it's important to, when you're, for any culture, for any community, to look at what your social challenges are and what the needs are for the public funds. I think in this country, one of our biggest challenges is adoption on the broadband, which we're working together on.
Yeah, before I go out to the audience for questions, Robert, if I could suggest, Bob, that one of the areas that I think you and other academics could really help in the debate here is we hear a lot about South Korea, Japan, and their extraordinary speeds, but what I never can get a copy of is any sort of study that talks about what impact those very, very high speeds are having. There's always discussion about the fact that speeds go faster, applications become more available and are change over time. But as far as I can tell, if I think about Japan, productivity in Japan has been for this past decade, as it was for the decade before and the 2 decades before, relatively low. It's not clear, and when I go to Korea, I hear a lot from the Korean government and from Korean people how they use it, which is primarily video sharing and amongst family members and so forth. But it's that use of that additional speed as compared to 50, which is fairly common in the United States and many other places in the world. It's not clear to me exactly what the bang for the buck in terms of, from a societal perspective, we see. So I'm hoping that over time we're going to see some further information along that will help government policymakers on these things. So let me turn to the audience and see if we have any questions or comments from the audience. Harold, thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of things I'd like to toss out. First of all, I think that with regard to comment Carlos was making, I'm not sure exactly what the distinction is between concerns about net neutrality and broader concerns about the open internet. I mean, if you're talking about we ought to be able to do things like, have models around sender pays, okay. I don't see what that has to do with an open internet, and that has everything to do with the question of the economic models. But issues around things like privacy, internet censorship, all of those things are critical open internet issues that certainly ought to be discussed. They just don't have anything to do with the net neutrality debate in the same way that the issues that Rebecca mentioned around infant mortality don't really have anything to do with the discussion. The other thing I would point out is particularly with regard to the developing world, because I was also in Dubai with David, and we're talking to a lot of the civil society organizations who were there, and there is a tremendous concern and ambivalence. It is, on the one hand, they are suspicious many times of their own governments if they are free speech organizations for reasons that people have identified with, but they are also very suspicious of globalization, the American position that simply liberalization of markets is going to bring them broadband that they need, and they're very concerned about what they have to pay in terms of things like filtering against spam and so forth. What are the innovative solutions that we can put out there that are can be addressed to the developing world, which go beyond the traditional hi, I'm a U.S. mega corporation and I'm here to help you, and move to something that is perhaps more collaborative, more acceptable within this context.
Yep, Rebecca?
So just a couple of thoughts, because it's a hard question, and pushing back on your pushback on the infant mortality point doesn't have anything to do with broadband. It has to do with where you're going to put limited public funds. And so it reminds me, there was a story I was reading on the plane coming out here in the New York Times about a bunch of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who are working in Africa to try to just get water. So it's my anecdotal impression from talking to people is in the urban areas of a lot of these countries, they've got decent broadband. It's when you get out into the rural areas that there's a huge problem. And in some of those African countries, in addition to trying to get them broadband, they're struggling to get water. And so it's all just, it's in the larger context that we think about these things. In terms of, and I totally agree with your reaction, Harold. The fourth story I guess I would have told was USTTI is an organization that's been around forever that brings in regulators and ministers from developing countries to get a whole set of conversations with mostly US government folks. And they had a group of people coming in that USTTI brought in this year, and it was clear that what they were concerned about was exactly what you say, practical stuff, spam. Where do I go if I don't go to the ITU to get help with spam? So one of the things that we're working on, and we're not sure if we're going to be able to do it, but there's an international organization called MOG, it's an acronym, I don't remember what it stands for, that has, Google's in it, Comcast is in it, a number of engineers from around the world have been working to develop protocols and best practices, and so we're trying to get them funded, the engineers funded to go to the IGF to provide some just one-off practical hands-on messages for how these people can themselves do it. So I think one good model is some of the professional technical engineers. These people will not even go, including our own engineers, if there are any policy people alongside with them. They just want to talk engineer to engineer. So I think that's one way to get at it. Yeah, no policy cooties.
Carlos?
No, I would like to answer your first question or comment on this differentiation between net neutrality on the open internet. Let me repeat that we are not especially concerned, we have no any concern with the net neutrality discussion. So we think that the net neutrality discussion raises some real problems, and we are open to consider, to discuss, to debate, and to introduce any needed measure to avoid any problem with the net neutrality based on these two principles, transparency and non-discrimination. But when in the middle of this discussion over the net neutrality, we made a question, are really our customers worried for the net neutrality problems? And in other words, which are the concerns of our customers in the way they are using internet and in their internet experience? And we have shown two things. First, that net neutrality and the problems connected with net neutrality are not on the top of the list, and our customers think that differentiated quality of service is good for them. They understand very well pricing policies. They understand very well that we can charge different prices for different services. So that we have seen is that net neutrality is not on the priorities of our customers. And we have asked our customers of which are the problems they have when they are using the internet access that we provide them. And the list is very different. And the problems that really are in the concerns of our customers are the list that I explained before. Portability of digital life, music, applications, information, interoperability of operating systems, this difference of two operating systems in the mobile arena, the problems of privacy, the problems of security, the problems of transparency. Our customers are not aware that 80% of the information that they receive when they are using internet, somebody has paid for it. So I think that are the things that we want to put on the table too, and to open the debate. And we are absolutely open to discuss on net neutrality. But we want to put on the table all these issues too. And this is that we call the discussion over the open internet. We want to discuss not just over net neutrality, but all the problems that our customers are facing in the use of the internet.
Ed, you look like you wanted to jump in. Did you want to do that? Or?
No, I did. I mean, I think that's a good statement. I think you have customers care when they're experiencing discrimination and they're experiencing a world where net neutrality is not being reasonably practiced. Then you will have the concern. So that's a statement of perhaps good practices.
All right, so we don't completely devolve into a discussion of net neutrality. Luigi was next up.
David, thanks. I have just one question on one important issue, that is EU-US cooperation in the field of ICT. Because at the end of the story, we have to remember that we together, Europe and US, we represent 50% of the GDP worldwide. So we are an important area of the world. Now, last year, the famous acronym has been WICIT. I suspect that this year the new one will be TTIP, which does mean Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. Why this will be important? Because there will be a focus also on ICT. David, you know very well this. And the major focus will be on regulation. What can be done between Europe and US in order to harmonize the regulation? Now, my question to all the panelists is this. I share a lot what Carlos López Blanco has said, also on the need to discuss a new agenda. Why this time we don't start to discuss now these issues? And we as industry, we ask EU-US to put the issues that Carlo was referring to in our agenda. Because my fear is this. We know that there are many differences in the regulatory system between Europe and US, in particular in regulation and wholesale access. But what at least we should prevent is the new legislation. Maybe that in September, European Commission could announce a piece of legislation provision of net neutrality. Why we don't discuss this now together, EU-US? Because otherwise the risk that there will be fragmentation and more differences And I think that this could be a good occasion to raise such kind of issues, and I would ask what the panelists think about this.
Who would like to take the TTIP question about the trade negotiations that have just begun?
Well, from a U.S. perspective, I don't see what there is to be gained from our attempting to try to force the Europeans to a different regulatory structure. I mean, the last time we went around this, we were selling unbundling, which now we have to admit was a mistake. What are we going to sell today? I'm not sure there is a policy that fits all. I think perhaps one of the problems of Europe is that too much authority resides in Brussels and the Commission, when the problems are very different across the various countries. Some countries have a lot of platform competition, others don't. Somehow the Commission seems paralyzed and is unable to come off a mandate for uniform policy across very disparate countries.
Maybe one of the ways in which we can attack Luigi's question is the comments, Carlos, that you made about privacy being one of the key, and we've spent a lot of time yesterday hearing about privacy, security, those related issues. For global services like cloud computing and this sort, obviously having a fundamentally different regulatory environment in Europe than in the United States on some of these issues. We've had now for the past, 20 years or so, a safe harbor that's allowed much of this to go forward. But we now have statements being made from Europe questioning whether or not the safe harbor could be continued going forward. Do you all have any views? I know Erica does, so we could go to Erica as well.
Yeah, and I think that this will be part of the discussion in the next panel, I think. Yeah. So, but let me refer to the issue that has been raised by Luigi. So I think that first, WICIT is a very good precedent because WICIT shows us what not to do again. Because I think that the way in which the industry and some governments faced the process of WICIT is something that we should not repeat again. The TTIP for me is probably the last opportunity for Europe and the United States in the telecom sector. Because today, still the telecom sector has two main pillars. And it's a transatlantic sector, Europe and the United States. But the situation in 10 years' time will be very, very different. That means, in terms of a specific regulation for the telecom sector, and for me, it's essential in this process to try to find a common ground for investment, both sides of the Atlantic. But there is a huge opportunity to put on the table and to have a common understanding of the new problems of the internet world. That means privacy, that means security, data protection, and especially security, privacy, and data protection. Why? Because, and I think that this is a very urgent issue. Why? Because we have a very similar view. If we compare the view of the Americans and the Europeans on these issues, it's very similar. If you compare with the views of the Russians, of the Chinese about these issues. And I think that if you are not able to have now this common ground on how to face these new problems, in 10 years' time, we will have to have this discussion with Russians, with Chinese, and they have a different position, a different view, and a different sensitivity. So we think, and I think that this is a huge, but the last opportunity in the telecom sector. I think that not just in the telecom sector, but for sure in the telecom sector, to have this common ground and to keep the leadership that still Americans and Europeans have in the telecom sector.
Ed, you look like you want to jump in.
Well, first of all, I agree very strongly with much of what was said. To just put TTIP in context, it is not a telecom internet treaty. It has a wide range of subjects. And there are some subjects, I think, in our area that will be discussed and should be. I think privacy is certainly one. I think there are a number of important topics. we need to be aware of a couple things. And we're very supportive of the negotiations and having them active and cover many subjects. But there is a danger in this kind of negotiation of the tail wagging the dog, or in this case, actually, we're the tail and the dog's going to wag us. We could be traded off in important issues. And so there's a need to be wary of the process. And there is I think, a recognition that while there are some critical issues, and having a more united front to the rest of the world is absolutely right, and some of the issues may well be ripe for trade negotiations, there are other issues where we are so difficult, have so much difficulty in defining for ourselves what good policy is. Question whether or not they are ripe and sufficiently matured to have a negotiation with other players, the blind playing, who knows where we are on some of these issues. So I want to try to tackle them, but I also think we ought to be realistic that in some areas getting solutions that have real consensus is going to be very difficult, and we be careful not to force a solution on a subject like cybersecurity that is hard to really know whether we have the right answers. We don't want to impose a uniform set of answers that are untested and hypothetical and too risky. So we're supportive of it, but very wary at the same time.
Rebecca?
So just completely agree, and I'm having a flashback to what was going on with the 96 negotiations with the WTO agreements. Two quick points. One is in terms of trying to create as much alliance between U.S. and European countries. One of the questions I got a lot internally as we were leading up to the WICT, and it was unusual for a U.S.-bound company like Comcast to be involved in an international negotiation because these issues are viewed as international. But we were very committed to this in large, primarily because we realize that you need to have good global structures in place or we will all be disadvantaged. And the huge part, people would ask, well, so if we don't agree, we're not bound by any of these provisions, right? And the answer is no, we're not. But I think the overall long-term risk is a fractured internet where you start seeing regions or groups of countries that kind of pull out, and what's been essential for the growth of the internet globally is the frictionless, as much as possible, connectivity and transfer. And so I think that we need to, and I don't think we came out of the WICT in a great spot, frankly. And so I think that we need to, from a normative standpoint, be able to continue to lead and create as many commonalities among like-minded, sort of moderate countries as we possibly can. On the trade issue, completely agree, and particularly with Ed's point that you got to be careful because you can, in those negotiations, get traded off on, agriculture or something, and you don't ever really know.
God forbid.
You never really know what's going on. That's the joke that you're not supposed to put in Politico. But I think that, privacy has been with us forever, right? The European-US privacy. And we'll have to keep muddling along and trying to find some common ground. I think the goal is to make it as frictionless as possible so that we can do trade without locking ourselves or forcing our trade partners into particular regimes that may not end up being where any of us want to be 5-10 years from now. I'm reminded we negotiated, when I was at the FCC, a mutual recognition agreement with Europe to come up with ways to test each other's equipment that gave us each a lot of flexibility, but it just reduced the friction. So I think on a lot of these issues, you just definitely have to take them on an issue-by-issue basis. On net neutrality, my assumption, my hunch, we'll see is that we will just regress to the mean over time and look very similar.
Erica, you wanted to ask a question before we started to get into all this other stuff.
Yeah, I like to make more, Erica Mann, Facebook. I like to make more a comment, if you allow me. Mm-hmm. So looking at what Carlos and Luigi said, I think it's true. We have to be, when we look long-term and not short-term, we have to understand that although our business models in the moment between the different sectors vary to a large degree, and we do have some disputes, I think in the long term we should be more interested what we have in common and how we can define and really thrive in this new digital environment. And my comment is just one which relates to it. And I don't know if you have seen the US ITC report which came out, which is actually a marvelous one, and I can only recommend all of you to read it. It's about digital trade growing in the United States and globally. And the title, I think, is, let me have a look at that. I can't find the title. It's something about digital trade in the United States and in the global economy. It's marvelous. It's the first part which just came out, and the second part will come out in I think next year, in summer 2014. And it's actually this missing piece which we never had on information, because we have great information collected in the past about the interconnectedness between Europe and the United States, and interconnectedness in our two economies. But the digital part of it was always missing. We had ICT numbers, very rogue and ICT numbers, but they never really showed how deeply we are interconnected and how much we are depending on the global economy as well. So it's not just bilateral, but it's the global picture as well, which was missing. So I can only recommend to look at this, because I think this will give us arguments and more understanding what we actually should do with TTIP, what we should do in the visit environment, what we should do, even unilaterally with regard to certain agreements which we may have to make, either the safe harbor or maybe we don't need the safe harbor, but whatever. We should look at this. I think if we have a better understanding now, and hopefully this will help us to overcome some of the difficulties we see sometimes too strongly.
Well, I think that's a terrific way to end our panel. Let me just mention, before thanking the panelists, that one of the themes that have run through the past day or so has been whether or not the U.S. is behind, and how far we're behind others in these areas. That sort of concern is not limited, of course, to the United States. I'll just quote to you a statement in a speech that Neelie Kroes, the commissioner in Europe, made just last month. In her view, from Europe's perspective, quote, "The rest of the world is racing ahead. America, Japan, Korea have 88% of the world's 4G subscriptions, and the EU has just 6. Meanwhile, only 2% of European homes have super-fast broadband." So it's not only us who are worried about falling behind. As far as I can tell, everybody is worried about falling behind. An interesting and perhaps very hopeful signal to all of us. Let me also mention that the issues that we're discussing today are not just, in retrospect, and not just about us, but are truly global. And my guess is that they will be the centerpiece of discussions in next year's treaty conference at the ITU, the plenipotentiary in Korea, in October and November. Again, that's another treaty conference that will be making international law that will affect the U.S. And unlike the situation at WICID, where we decided not to sign that, it will be a real challenge for us there, because the pressures to sign, this is the convention of the ITU, will be extraordinarily strong. And therefore, all of us, government, industry, NGOs, and others, working together to make sure we have a very good outcome there, will be very, very strong. And with that, let us thank our great panelists for a terrific session.